So now that we have a good understanding of how to create the effect of reflection mapping, in this chapter we're going to focus on how to use reflection mapping to create some specific surface properties. Metal is one of the kinds of surfaces that we know has reflections. So in this chapter we're going to focus on how to use the reflections that we talked about in the last chapter to make metal. The first effect that I want to focus on is the property of some metals to create reflections that aren't super sharp. We can see in this example, these reflections are like chrome. This is like a perfect mirror reflection. But most metal is tarnished or smudged, and the reflections end up being just a little bit blurry. And so what we're going to do now is talk about how to achieve this blurry effect. One way to do it would be to take our cube map and just add some blur to the cube map itself. However, that's not the best way because generally a cube map represents the environment that your object is in, and you're going to want to have lots of different objects in that environment, all using that same cube map. And if you blur the cube map, then all the objects have to have the same blurriness. What I'm going to do is show you a way of blurring the cube map on a per object basis instead of for the whole environment. And I'm going to use an HLSL intrinsic function called TextCube LOD. Now what we're going to do, and this is kind of tricky, we're going to force our texture sampler here to sample from a lower LOD level, or so our cube map has several bitmaps, which are smaller versions of itself. And instead of sampling from the highest resolution map, we're going to force the sampler to grab a sample from a lower and therefore blurrier version of our bitmap chain. So we're going to come right in here and say TextCube LOD, and that is the HLSL intrinsic function that allows us to specify what bitmap level or LOD level of our texture to sample from. Now, TextCube takes a cube map sampler and a float3, which is the vector we're using to look up into our cube map. But in this case, TextCube LOD uses a float4. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to type float4. And the first three components of our float4 are going to be our reflection vector. But the last component, we need to add one more value here. And this component is going to be our LOD level. So first of all, I'm just going to start off by adding a 0. That's going to be our top or our highest resolution LOD. So if I save this, you'll notice that there's no change. So we're sampling from our highest level LOD and it's still nice and sharp. Well, let's come back over here and change this value to 6, meaning we're going 6 levels down in our bitmap chain. So I'm just going to type 6 here and save it and wait for it to update. And wow, look at that. Now we have a nice brushed metal teapot, lots of blurry reflections. So we no longer have mirror reflections. Now we have something more akin to an aluminum look, or something that's not quite so perfectly reflective. Now what I like to do is demonstrate this effect to you by adding another control up here in the header. So let's find the spot where we specify our specular glossiness. I'm just going to copy this bit of header code and duplicate it, and we're going to call this reflection blur. And our minimum value is going to be 0. That's our highest LOD level of our bitmap chain. And let's make our maximum value 10. And then here for the UI name, we're just going to call it reflection blur. All right, and our default value, let's give it a default value of something like 6. Okay, so let's come down here, and instead of our hard-coded 6 value, we're going to use that reflection blur that we grabbed from the header. So I'll save that, come back over here to max, and I'm going to bring up the material panel. And now you'll notice that I have this new entry here called reflection blur. And watch really carefully over here in the viewport as I change this value. What you'll see is it sharpens the reflections up really nicely. I can just slide that there, or I can go back the other way and blur them out, blow them out all the way so it's just completely blurry. And eventually it goes to just one solid color. All right, so let's go back to something nice, maybe 5. We got some really nice looking blurry reflections. Okay, that's good. But what about varying surface properties? Most things aren't uniformly reflective, whether it's mirror reflection or blurry reflection. Most things aren't uniform. So what we need is a method of varying the blurriness across the surface. And for that, we need a texture. So what I've done here is we'll bring up Photoshop really quick. And here in Photoshop, I've created a simple texture where the RGB channel is white and the alpha channel is kind of this checkerboard pattern. Some of the checks are black, some are white, and some are kind of a mixed gray. So let's go back to Effects Composer, and we're going to put that texture map here into our diffuse texture. I named that texture D reflection test. Just going to throw that in there. And just for now, I'm going to turn off our specular so that doesn't distract us. So now what we need to do is grab the alpha channel of our diffuse texture, which has that checkerboard pattern in it, and multiply that by a reflection blur. I'm going to come up to here where we sample our diffuse texture. Our variable name is color texture. And I'm going to paste it down here, reflection blur times color texture dot A, and we're adding that dot A on the end, remember, because we want to use the alpha channel. So I'll save this, and now take a look. So we've got some areas that are blurry and some areas that are sharp. Boy, that's a really neat looking effect. And we can still use our reflection blur value to control how blurry things are. So if we leave our reflection blur value at 0, you can't tell that there's that checkerboard pattern there. But as soon as I turn this up, now there starts to become a differentiation between areas of blurry reflection and areas of sharp reflection. Really nice effect. And what we're actually doing here is multiplying our reflection blur value, which is somewhere between 0 and 10, by our alpha channel. So wherever our texture is white, we come back here into Photoshop, on the white squares, we're multiplying this value by 1, so we get the full value. So if our reflection blur setting is at 10, multiplied by 1, we're actually getting the lowest possible bitmap. But if our alpha channel is black and it's 0, then we're multiplying this by 0, giving us 0 as a result, and that's where we're getting the sharp reflections. And you'll notice that no matter how high I go here, I can go all the way up to 10, I still have some areas that are sharp. And that's because these areas are the black sections of my checkerboard. So I'm controlling the blurriness using the alpha channel of our diffuse texture. Now, it doesn't matter what channel of what texture you use. You can use any channel you want. But the takeaway point here is we can control the blurriness across the surface of our model using a texture map. Well, that's pretty cool. But right now what we've got is an object that is only reflection. It's got some neat blurry reflections and some sharp reflections, but it's only reflective, and there's no other surface details. We're not really using the diffuse and specular part of our code, because right at the end of the last chapter, we commented that bit out, and we're just returning purely reflection. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get rid of this bit here, and we're going to switch back to our ambient, diffuse, and specular. So I'll save that. Let's just take a look at what happens. So now we've got just a plain white teapot. You can see a little bit of the reflection here because I've got one small mistake here in my code that I just want to get rid of. I'm actually multiplying reflection by our ambient value, and I'm going to get rid of that. And we'll save it. And now we should just have a plain white teapot. And I'll come back in here, and I'm going to turn the specular back up. So you can see that we have our specular highlight. Maybe I'll turn the diffuse down a little bit. All right, so now we have just our plain ambient, diffuse, and specular lighting. And what I want to show you now is how to mix the reflection together with the ambient, diffuse, and specular. And in order to do that, I'm going to come right in here where we calculate our diffuse, and I'm going to use a lerp. So I'm going to say diffuse equals lerp, and lerp stands for linear interpolation. It's just blending between one thing and another thing. And in this case, I'm going to blend between our diffuse and our reflections. And we're going to come back over here and use our friend, the alpha channel of the diffuse texture, also to blend between our diffuse and our reflections. Now, one thing I took out when I got rid of that return the reflection down here is the ×5 multiplier. And I actually really liked the effect that that was giving. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to add that back in right here on the end. It's going to say ×5. All right, let's see what this gives us. So we're blending between our diffuse and our reflection. So now you can see the areas that I had black in the alpha channel, or actually white rather, are showing our diffuse lighting, and the areas that I had black are showing our reflections. So pretty neat. Now we're blending between our diffuse lighting and our reflection maps. Just to show this off a little bit better, I made another sample texture in Photoshop. So let's bring up Photoshop again. And here's this new texture that I've made. I just grabbed a couple of the free textures that I have listed on my website. I grabbed this rust spot and this sort of painted chipped metal image. And I've also made an alpha channel for this. Now I've painted my rust spot black. I want to make sure that none of our reflection shows through in this rust spot because obviously rust isn't reflective. So I'm going to grab, for my diffuse texture, I'm going to grab D metal. And there you go. Pretty neat looking. Now the interesting thing with this is that I have this area here that's the rust that has no reflections at all. And that's because when I do this blend, my lerp, this is the part that shows when my diffuse texture is 0 or black. I mean, not my diffuse texture, my alpha channel. So when my alpha channel is black, I'm getting solid diffuse. And when my alpha channel is white, I'm getting solid reflection. So you'll notice that I have some areas here where I've painted the alpha channel white. Here it's kind of gray, and then here that alpha channel is black. So I've combined reflections with my rust pattern. And of course, I still have my nice reflection blur slider, so if I want my teapot to be even more blurry, I can add that. I can achieve a pretty neat looking effect. And actually, I want to come back over here to my code and just tweak this a little bit. Maybe instead of ×5, we're going to say ×4. Make it just a little bit darker. And you end up with a pretty convincing looking metal object. And the nice thing about this is that I can use that same cube map, that same reflection map, like I was saying at the beginning, for multiple objects. And each object can have a different reflection blur setting. So I can have some really shiny objects and some really blurry objects all using the same cube map. So there's a really nice example of how to use reflection mapping to create metal. And this is metal that has a spectrum of blurry to sharp reflections, and also some nice contrast between areas of reflectivity and no reflectivity at all. And it's all due to the TextCube LOD function and also to the lerp blend between my diffuse and my reflection. So we've talked about reflections, and in the next chapter we're going to talk about refraction, which is the tendency of some transparent or translucent objects to bend light.